At 4:30 in the morning on April 28, 1975, Colonel Bùi Quang Thận felt the earth tremble beneath his T-54 tank as artillery shells screamed overhead toward the sleeping city of Saigon. This isn't just another war story. This is the moment when the world's most powerful military machine met its match, when a peasant army achieved what seemed impossible, and when the course of the Cold War pivoted on the tracks of Soviet-built tanks rolling through the heart of South Vietnam. The Fall of Saigon didn't just end America's longest war. It redrew the global balance of power and proved that even superpowers could bleed. The humid air hung thick with diesel exhaust and cordite as the final offensive, officially designated the Ho Chi Minh Campaign, reached its crescendo. General Văn Tiến Dũng multi-course assault had compressed what should have been months of fighting into mere weeks of lightning advances. The taste of victory mixed with the metallic tang of ammunition in the mouths of soldiers who had been marching for 30 years. From his position in the 203rd Armoured Brigade, Thun could see the orange glow of fires dotting the horizon where Tan Son Nhut Air Base lay under bombardment. The irony wasn't lost on him yesterday. A South Vietnamese Air Force pilot named Nguyen Thanh Trung had defected with captured A-37 aircraft from Da Nang and bombed his own former base. The sight of VNAF planes attacking VNAF installations had sent shockwaves through the remaining ARVN defenders and triggered the final American helicopter evacuation. The campaign that brought them to this moment had begun with political approval on March 31st, but its roots stretched back through decades of struggle against French colonial forces and American intervention. What made this offensive different wasn't just its speed, though PAVN forces had covered 20 to 30-kilometer stages in forced night marches, but its coordination. 4 separate corps advanced in echelons, the 1st Corps with the battle-tested 304th, 312th, and 320B divisions, the 2nd Corps bringing the 10th and 316th divisions, the 3rd Corps deploying the 320th and 7th divisions, and the 232nd Front closing from the southwest like a steel noose. Political oversight came from the Central Office for South Vietnam, where Le Duc Tho and Pham Hung shaped both strategy and the messaging that would follow victory. They understood that winning the war was only half the battle. Winning the peace required careful political choreography. The collapse had accelerated beyond anyone's expectations after Hue fell on March 25th and Da Nang crumbled just 4 days later. Tens of thousands of ARVN prisoners and mountains of American-supplied material had fallen into PAVN hands, but more importantly, the psychological dam had burst. South Vietnamese forces that had fought courageously for years suddenly seemed to lose the will to resist. By late April, PAVN artillery units had positioned their 130mm guns within 27 kilometers of central Saigon, their range allowing them to interdict both Tan Son Nhut Air Base and the crucial highways Route 1 and Route 13 that served as the city's lifelines. The sound of their shells whistling overhead had become as regular as temple bells, marking time toward an inevitable conclusion. The climactic battle at Xuan Loc from April 9th to 21st had pinned down the ARVN 18th Division in what many considered the last coherent southern defense. While ARVN forces fought with desperate courage, PAVN commanders simply redirected their axes of advance, cut the logistics lines, and let geography do the rest. The lesson was clear. Static defense meant death in this new kind of warfare. Logistics columns had been hauling thousands of tons of 122mm and 130mm shells, RPG-7 rockets, and diesel fuel by bicycle, truck, and human porters along Route 20 and the legendary Ho Chi Minh Trail. Women volunteers in black pajamas and conical hats counted truckloads at staging areas, their red armbands bright against the diesel haze as they waved traffic batons to direct the flow of war material. The directive from General Dung had been brutally simple. Dan Nan, Stung Nan, strike fast, win fast. Speed wasn't just tactical preference, it was strategic necessity. Every hour of delay risked American reintervention and gave ARVN forces time to regroup south of the Dong Nai River. The window of opportunity was measured in days, not weeks. Tank crews like Thun's had learned to work around the mechanical challenges of urban warfare. T-54 and T-59 engines overheated in the stop-and-go movement through narrow alleys, forcing crews to pause and pry roofing tin off fenders while clearing bicycle frames jammed in their tracks. The sounds of the city, church bells, motor scooters, crying children mixed with the rumble of diesel engines in a surreal urban symphony. Street-level assault groups carried satchel charges weighing 2 to 5 kilograms, Bangalore torpedoes for breaching obstacles, and AK-47s loaded with 120 to 180 rounds. They moved through the city like water finding cracks, using wall-hopping techniques and sewer routes that clandestine cells had mapped during months of preparation. Every police post, fuel depot and radio node had been catalogued on hand-drawn block plans that advancing battalions received on April 29th and 30th. Political cadres in each regiment carried surrender leaflets and portable loudspeakers, broadcasting offers of Kwan Hong leniency to ARVN soldiers who laid down their arms. The propaganda war was as important as the shooting war, and KOSVN had prepared for Trio Ke Gi Phong, raising liberation flags within 24 hours of victory. Units carried rolled red and blue banners with golden stars, ready for instant public optics. The April humidity, hovering in the mid-80s Fahrenheit, left equipment straps slick with sweat and made every movement exhausting under the tropical sun. Can you imagine the weight of history pressing down on your shoulders as you advance through a city that represents everything your cause has fought against for 3 decades? If you're watching this late at night in your comfortable home, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us bring you more untold stories from perspectives you've never heard. Drop a comment about which aspect of this campaign surprises you most. But as Colonel Thun adjusted his steel helmet and checked his watch, he couldn't have known that in less than 48 hours, he would be climbing the roof of the Independence Palace to raise the liberation flag over the most symbolic target in South Vietnam. The radio crackled with Bing Crosby's White Christmas at 10:51 a.m. on April 29, 1975, an eerie soundtrack that PAVN intercept units would later remember as the musical herald of their victory. The song wasn't Christmas nostalgia, it was the code for Operation Frequent Wind, America's final evacuation from Vietnam, as helicopters lifted off from embassy rooftops, carrying the last remnants of a 30-year commitment. North Vietnamese tank crews were already calculating firing solutions for targets that had seemed untouchable just weeks before. The most powerful military in human history was retreating, while peasant soldiers advanced through streets that reeked of burning files and abandoned dreams. The breakthrough had come faster than even the most optimistic PAVN planners had dared hope. At the Newport Bridge, Ko Tan Kang to the local sapper teams had used hollow charges to blast their way across while civilians jammed the spans in chaos. Ox carts creaked alongside Honda motorcycles as families fled with whatever possessions they could carry, leaving trails of discarded luggage that told stories of shattered lives in leather suitcases and cloth bundles. Tank Commander Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Thor could taste the diesel exhaust mixing with his own adrenaline as his T-54, bearing the number 390, rumbled through the suburbs toward the city centre. Behind him, Tank 843 followed in formation, their steel tracks chewing up asphalt that had been laid by American engineers who never imagined it would carry the vehicles of their defeat. The strategic deception had worked perfectly. While dummy regimental radios chattered near Cu Chi, broadcasting false positions and phantom movements, the main columns had swung through Hoc Mon and Na Be to divide the city into manageable grids. PAVN engineers had laid 30-ton pontoon ferries across the Dong Nai under cover of darkness, and by dawn, columns of ZIL and Molotov trucks were crossing under tarp camouflage, carrying the ammunition and fuel that would sustain the final push. The sensory assault was overwhelming, hot asphalt smell mixed with Bougainvillea's sweet perfume, while the metallic tick of cooling tank engines provided a mechanical heartbeat to the advancing revolution. Soldiers who had been born in villages, lit by kerosene lamps, found themselves thundering past neon signs and glass storefronts that seemed like visions from another world. Inside the city, clandestine cells that had operated in shadow for years finally emerged into daylight, handing their precious hand-drawn maps to advancing battalions. Every police post, every fuel depot, every radio transmitter had been catalogued during months of patient surveillance. The maps showed more than tactical positions, they revealed the nervous system of a government that was about to stop breathing. PAVN sappers moved through the urban landscape like skilled surgeons, knowing exactly where to cut. They carried satchel charges weighing 2 to 5 kilograms, enough explosive power to breach concrete barriers or reduce steel doors to twisted metal. The sound of their Bangalore torpedoes echoed through neighborhoods where children had played hopscotch just hours before. At Tan Son Nhut Air Base, the morning sky filled with the thunder of rotor blades as American helicopters lifted desperate evacuees toward aircraft carriers waiting offshore. The irony was bitter. Many of the helicopters would be pushed overboard from the USS Midway and USS Blue Ridge to make room for more refugees. Deck logs would later record more than a dozen aircraft shoved into the South China Sea, million-dollar machines sacrificed to save human lives. The most shocking moment came when Major Buang Li somehow managed to land a tiny O-1 Bird Dog observation plane on the USS Midway's flight deck, his family crammed into a cockpit designed for one. Deck crews literally dumped helicopters overboard to clear landing space, creating an image that would define America's chaotic withdrawal. Back on the ground, PAVN artillery observers watched their 130mm shells walk across Tan Son Nhut's runways, each impact sending up geysers of concrete and twisted metal. The base that had been the symbol of American air power in Southeast Asia was being systematically dismantled by guns that had been hauled through jungle trails by bicycle and human muscle. SA-7 gunners reported that heat shimmer rising from Route 1 made target acquisition difficult against low-flying aircraft. Standard operating procedure called for firing at 600 to 800 meters when American Hueys popped flares too late to confuse the heat-seeking missiles. The psychological effect was as important as the physical damage. Every helicopter shot down reminded ARVN forces that the sky was no longer safe. In the palace basement, the air already smelled of diesel fuel and floor wax, as President Duong Văn Minh prepared for a surrender that everyone knew was inevitable. The building above him shook with each artillery impact, and dust drifted down from the ceiling like snow in a city that had never seen winter. PAVN units reported ammunition expenditure rates of 300 to 500 rounds per platoon in the brief firefights that still flared across the city. Most resistance collapsed once police precincts began laying down their weapons, but isolated pockets of ARVN soldiers fought with the courage of men who knew they were writing the final chapter of their cause. The radio traffic told the story in fragments, frantic calls for air support that would never come, ammunition requests that couldn't be filled, evacuation orders for positions that were already overrun. A PAVN radio operator in District 3 logged 19 separate ceasefire calls between 9 a.m. and noon, with some ARVN posts asking for written guarantees before they would stack their rifles. Buddhist pagodas rang their bells at dusk on April 30th, their bronze voices mixing with the rumble of truck convoys as monks handed water ladles to dusty infantrymen at temple gates. The sight of saffron robes blessing soldiers in green uniforms created a tableau that photographers would have killed to capture. The smell of wet paper rose from heaps of shredded ministry files after a sudden noon downpour on May 1st, the rain turning state secrets into pulp while children paddled paper boats along the curb streams. Can you feel the weight of inevitability pressing down as the last American helicopters disappear over the horizon, while tank engines grow louder in the streets below? But at 10:28 a.m. on April 30th, 1975, tanks 390 and 843 were still approaching the ornate gates of Independence Palace, their crews unaware that one tank's gearbox would jam at the crucial moment, forcing the following tank to ram through the barrier and accidentally create one of history's most iconic images. Tank 390's gearbox seized with a grinding shriek of metal, just as it reached the ornate iron gates of Independence Palace at 11:30 a.m., April 30th, 1975. This wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was the moment when the Cold War's most symbolic fortress fell not to precision, bombing, or elaborate siegecraft, but to the crude expedient of one tank ramming another through a barrier that had protected the seat of South Vietnamese power for decades. The image of twisted metal and broken gates would telegraph around the world faster than any diplomatic cable, announcing that the era of American dominance in Southeast Asia had ended with the crash of steel on iron. Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Tho felt his heart skip as his T-54's transmission locked up mere meters from their target. The palace loomed above them, its white concrete walls gleaming in the tropical sun, while the sounds of gunfire echoed from scattered firefights throughout the city. Behind him, Tank 843's engine roared as its commander made a split-second decision that would create one of history. Still carried the smell of diesel fuel and floor wax, the mundane sense of government business now overlaid with the acrid smoke of approaching war. Dust drifted down from the ceiling with each artillery impact, creating a grey snow. The surrender itself was almost anticlimactic after the drama of the breakthrough. At 10:30 a.m., just minutes before the tanks arrived, PAVN officers in their crisp green uniforms had already accepted Min's capitulation in a basement room that felt more like a corporate boardroom than the site of a nation's death. The real theatre came with the radio broadcast that followed. Toi keu goyan em bin si vien ch borsung do hang vodio kien. I call on ARVN soldiers to lay down their weapons and surrender unconditionally." The words crackled through speakers to PAVN squads advancing on Vo Thi Sao Street, each syllable a nail in the coffin of the Republic of Vietnam. Colonel Bùi Quang Thun's climb to the palace roof became the visual punctuation mark for victory. As he hauled himself up through the humid air, sweat stinging his eyes under his steel helmet, Saigon spread out below him like a conquered city from ancient legend. The sticky tropical heat made every movement deliberate, but the weight of the liberation flag in his hands felt lighter than air. The moment he unfurled the red and blue banner with its golden star, photographers captured an image that would grace propaganda posters for decades. But Thun later remembered the sounds, more than the sights, the distant rumble of tank engines, the sporadic crack of rifles, and the strange quiet that seemed to spread outward from the palace, like ripples from a dropped stone. What the cameras couldn't capture were the discoveries waiting inside the palace itself. PAVN sappers found refrigerators stocked with French pâté and champagne, luxury goods that seemed to mock the sacrifices of soldiers who had survived on 700 grams of rice per day, plus dried fish or canned meat. Many first-time city soldiers tasted canned fruit cocktail that day, the sweet syrup, a revelation to men whose rations had been measured in survival rather than pleasure. The contrast was jarring soldiers, who wore tire-tread sandals and carried spare insoles pinned to their rucksacks, with safety wire now walked through marble halls where South Vietnamese officials had entertained American generals. Some units bivouacked in cinema lobbies, sleeping atop velvet seats while projectors sat warm with reels of Hong Kong martial arts films half-threaded in their mechanisms. Outside the palace, the machinery of occupation began with ruthless efficiency. PAVN rear echelons established collection points, Diem Tup Ket within 12 to 24 hours to register ARVN prisoners. By May 1st, thousands of former government soldiers queued under banyan trees and corrugated metal sheds, their faces carrying the hollow look of men who had bet everything on the wrong side of history. The streets told their own stories. Along Truong Sa Canal, residents boiled rice in dented aluminum pots while soldiers swapped, captured sea rations, canned pears and crackers for local cigarettes like Tam Dao and Song Ko. The informal economy of conquest operated on street corners, where the smell of cooking, rice mixed with gun oil and exhaust fumes. Engineers immediately began clearing unexploded ordnance from Tan Son Nhut Air Base, marking hazards with red-painted pickets and ammunition crates. The runways that had launched B-52 raids and fighter-bomber sorties now sprouted warning flags like deadly flowers, each marker representing another piece of American military hardware rendered harmless. The Thien Ger Zoo's elephants trumpeted at night as artillery thumped in the distant suburbs, their ancient voices adding a surreal soundtrack to the urban battlefield. Keepers fed them cassava leaves scavenged from villa gardens, maintaining routines of care even as the world changed around them. A sapper company marked time by the church clocks, Notre Dame cathedrals, bells chiming the half-hour while laying telephone lines from the palace to City Hall. The prosaic work of connecting the new government proceeded alongside the dramatic moments, reminding everyone that revolution required both bullets and bureaucracy. Can you imagine the mixture of triumph and exhaustion that must have filled those soldiers as they realized they had actually done it, toppled a government that had seemed permanent just weeks before? The city's transformation was visible in details that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. PAVN quartermasters issuing locally made sandals and khaki shirts, while many soldiers kept their jungle blacks as talismans from their Truong Son mountain days. But even as liberation flags flew from government buildings throughout the city, the real work of victory was just beginning, and in the markets of Cho Loan, civilian committees were already preparing to reopen commerce under new management within 48 hours. In Chur Ben Than Market, at dawn on May 2nd, 1975, the smell of pomfret and catfish mixed with gun oil as vendors sold iced tea and beer bottles for 2 to 3 dong to hoarse soldiers still wearing jungle fatigues. This moment marked more than military conquest. It was the birth of a new social order that would transform not just Vietnam, but the entire Cold War calculus in Southeast Asia. The speed of civilian adaptation revealed something profound about human resilience and the practical realities of survival under any flag. While politicians in Washington and Moscow debated ideology, ordinary people in Saigon were already learning the economics of revolution, one street vendor transaction at a time. The sensory transformation of the city was immediate and overwhelming. Along the Neo Loc Thien Ger Canal, gasoline slicks from destroyed fuel depots created rainbow patterns on the water's surface, while papery ash from burned government files drifted like grey snow. The tang of cordite and exhaust mixed with the sweet scent of ripe jackfruit hanging from courtyard trees, creating an olfactory map of a world caught between war and peace. Civilian committees in Chur Lone had reopened markets within 48 hours of the surrender, their loudspeakers crackling with official price announcements for rice, fish sauce, and charcoal. The speed was remarkable. These were the same markets that had served French colonials, Japanese occupiers, and American advisors. Now they were adapting to serve their latest customers, soldiers who had never seen electric lights until they entered the city. Many PAVN fighters experienced culture shock that rivaled any combat trauma. Veterans' letters home described escalators in hushed, almost disbelieving tones, as if they were reporting encounters with alien technology. Soldiers born in villages lit by kerosene lamps found themselves sleeping in cinema lobbies with velvet seats, projectors still warm from the previous night's Hong Kong martial arts films. The administrative machinery of occupation moved with bureaucratic precision. Women volunteers in black pajamas, conical hats, and red armbands directed traffic at logistics points, their batons cutting through diesel haze as truck convoys rolled toward distribution centers. The 559th Transportation Group reported significant fuel losses from punctured drums damaged during the advance, but city depots offered intact ARVN storage tanks that could replace the leaky containers. Culture cells organized Vun Kong song breaks on the palace lawns by May 2nd, with soldiers singing Jiai Fong Mien Nam and Num Unem Tren, Mo Chiek Zai Tung. 5 brothers on one tank to signal normalcy to gathering crowds. The performances served multiple purposes: morale building for the troops, propaganda for civilians, and a demonstration that the new government controlled not just military force but cultural expression. A PAVN cook assigned to the palace kitchens discovered copper pots and imported spices that seemed to mock his years of subsistence rations. He boiled rice for 200 men in a battered wok, seasoning it with fish sauce, and what he later described as the taste of pride. The contrast between luxury and revolutionary austerity would become a recurring theme as the new order established itself. PAVN medics made do with whatever they could salvage or improvise, reusing glass morphine ampules and boiling scalpels in enamel basins. Field dressings were cloth squares folded to 10 by 10 centimeters and tied with gauze strips. The medical corps that had sustained an army through jungle warfare now faced the challenge of treating both their own wounded and processing thousands of ARVN prisoners who required care. The propaganda war continued even after the shooting stopped. Cadres collected typewriters, Gestetner duplicating machines, and teletype equipment to restart newspapers. The first editions trumpeted Jiai Fong Saigon in 72-point wood type that had been requisitioned from shuttered print shops. Every newspaper became a weapon in the battle for hearts and minds. A newly captured ARVN radio van became an impromptu recording studio, with soldiers cutting victory songs onto reel-to-reel tape while tanks idled outside. The image perfectly captured the intersection of military triumph and cultural transformation, modern technology, serving ancient songs of liberation that had sustained the movement through decades of struggle. Unit hygiene orders mandated saltwater footbaths to combat trench rot, a reminder that even in victory, the basic challenges of tropical warfare persisted. Soldiers wore their tire-tread Deprau sandals through marble halls where American generals had once planned operations, the contrast highlighting how far the revolution had traveled from its jungle origins. Food became a marker of transformation as soldiers discovered urban delicacies. City rations now included seized baguettes, condensed milk, and tins of lavash-ki-rit cheese from abandoned shops. Men who had survived on 700 grams of rice per day plus dried fish found themselves overwhelmed by the variety of available provisions. Some residents attempted to navigate the new reality through small acts of diplomacy. Many had sewn gold leaves into Audai hems as insurance against uncertain times, and soldiers collecting weapons sometimes returned hidden pistols if families offered an enamel teapot and rice cakes. These exchanges revealed the complex human negotiations that occurred beneath the surface of political transformation. A PAVN liaison team discovered that a Saigon tourist map printed in English proved clearer for navigation than some of their clandestine sketches. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. American tourism materials helping communist forces control the city they had just conquered. The map's ward numbers and street layouts had been designed to help visitors find restaurants and shops. Now they guided military patrols. By May 7th, 1975, PAVN units celebrated the 21st anniversary of Dien Bien Phu with a palace courtyard concert. Veterans carried banners listing fallen comrades and unit numbers, creating a visual roll call of sacrifice that connected the French defeat to the American withdrawal. The symbolism was deliberate. This was not just victory, but vindication of a strategy that had outlasted two superpowers. Can you imagine the psychological whiplash of moving from jungle foxholes to marble palaces in the span of a single month? But even as PAVN soldiers adapted to their new urban environment, trains from Hanoi were already loading with northern cement and rebar for the massive reconstruction effort that would transform not just Saigon but all of South Vietnam. In Hanoi at 6 a.m. on May 1st, 1975, loudspeakers around Din Tien Hoang Lake crackled with victory bulletins as crowds waved paper flags and ticket hawkers sold train seats south for 25 to 40 dong. This wasn't just regional celebration. This was the moment when a divided nation began stitching itself back together after 30 years of continuous warfare that had stretched from anti-French resistance through American intervention to final reunification. The sounds echoing across Hanoi's ancient streets carried the weight of vindicated strategy, of a political leadership that had outlasted 3 foreign armies through patience, planning, and an almost mystical faith in historical inevitability. For the Communist Party leadership, April 30th marked not just military victory but proof that their revolutionary theory could triumph over the world's most advanced military technology. The macro-political framing that emerged from Hanoi tied this victory to decades of struggle that party historians would later compress into neat phases. The anti-French period, from 1945 to 1954, the Chong Mi, anti-American phase, from 1955 to 1975, and the reunification proposals that were already being drafted for implementation by mid-1976. From the leadership's perspective in the capital, the Fall of Saigon represented the culmination of a grand strategy that had remained consistent even as tactics evolved. The same leaders who had planned the siege of Dien Bien Phu 21 years earlier were now orchestrating the political consolidation of the South. The continuity was intentional. This was not opportunistic conquest, but the logical conclusion of a liberation movement that had never wavered in its ultimate objectives. Freight trains loaded with northern cement and rebar began rolling towards Saigon Gia Dinh by June, their cargo representing more than reconstruction materials. Each car carried the physical manifestation of reunification northern industrial capacity flowing south to rebuild what war had destroyed. Bridge repair teams targeted spans over Vam Kor Dong and Dong Nai rivers first, recognizing that transportation infrastructure would determine whether political unification could become economic reality. The speed of political transformation matched the pace of military advance. By September 1975, the city's official name, Than Pho Ho Chi Minh, appeared on government seals, though street signs changed gradually as paint and stencils arrived from northern factories. The renaming wasn't just symbolic gesture, it represented the Communist Party's determination to erase the institutional memory of the defeated Republic of Vietnam. Party cadres had planned for rapid political consolidation in parallel with military operations, understanding that winning the peace required different skills than winning the war. Kok Tup Kai Tao re-education orders began sorting former officials by rank within days of victory. Ward boards posted reporting times, often at 7 a.m., at requisitioned schools and theatre halls. The bureaucratic precision reflected decades of experience governing in the north, now applied to a population that had lived under different systems. The Provisional Revolutionary Government's blue, red, yellow star flag flew beside the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's banner throughout the newly liberated territories. Cadres explained the symbolism during ward-level Sin Hot meetings, emphasizing continuity between the Southern Liberation Movement and helping Southern populations adjust to new political realities while maintaining the fiction of indigenous revolution. Veterans' memoirs from the campaign would later count dozens of comrades killed in the final week, even as most ARVN units crumbled without serious resistance. The casualties emphasized in unit roll calls served multiple purposes: honoring sacrifice, maintaining military discipline, and losses validated the struggle's seriousness while creating martyrs for future to a 30-year struggle that began in 1945 with Ho Chi Minh's Declaration of Independence. Revolutionary slogans condensed this historical arc into 4 words: Doc Lup Tu Du Thong Nhu Tan Phuc, independence, freedom, unification, happiness. The linguistic compression reflected communist political theory, where complex historical processes could be reduced to memorable formulas. The most shocking moment for PAVN interceptors came as American force helicopter frequency, ending with a clipped out just as T-54 tanks clattered past the palace gate. The juxtaposition captured the entire war's trajectory, American technology retreating while Vietnamese determination advanced through streets that still smelled of helicopter fuel and burned documents. For many northern soldiers entering Saigon, the sensory overload was overwhelming. The most frequently cited memory from first-time city entrance was the combination of hot asphalt smell, bougainvillea's electric bright flowers, and the metallic tick of cooling tank engines in the noon sun. These sensations would become embedded in revolutionary mythology, physical memories that connected abstract political theory to concrete experience. Commanders later argued that rapid political consolidation proved as decisive as armoured thrusts in securing victory. The party had prepared administrative structures in parallel with military planning, ensuring that political officers could establish control immediately after combat units secured territory. This dual-track approach reflected lessons learned from earlier campaigns, where military success had been undermined by administrative failures. The transformation extended beyond government to daily life. In Hanoi, revolutionary songs played from loudspeakers that had once broadcast air raid warnings. Children learned new lyrics that celebrated tank crews and liberation armies instead of resistance fighters and martyred heroes. The cultural shift was subtle, but profound victory allowed the party to move from defensive to triumphant messaging. Can you feel the weight of historical vindication that must have settled on party leaders who had endured decades of international isolation and military pressure? But even as political consolidation proceeded in both capitals, the human cost of transformation was becoming apparent in re-education camps where former officials faced uncertain futures under the new order. At 7 a.m. on May 3, 1975, former ARVN officers lined up outside a requisition school in District 3, their faces carrying the hollow expression of men who had discovered that losing a war meant more than changing uniforms. This moment revealed the brutal mathematics of political transformation victory. For some meant systematic humiliation for others, and the Communist Party's concept of Koan Hong, leniency, carried conditions that would reshape thousands of lives for decades to come. The speed with which re-education camps processed former officials demonstrated that the party had planned not just military conquest but social engineering on a massive scale. Every questionnaire, every classification, every assignment to rural labor camps represented a deliberate attempt to dismantle the old order's human infrastructure. The sensory landscape of defeat was as overwhelming as victory had been triumphant. In the basement corridors of converted schools and theatre halls, the smell of mimeograph ink mixed with nervous sweat as former government officials filled out forms that would determine their fates. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on faces that had once commanded respect in offices throughout South Vietnam. PAVN medics working in temporary aid stations found themselves treating both their own wounded and processing ARVN soldiers who required medical attention. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Men who had been shooting at each other days before now shared the same field hospitals. Glass morphine ampules were reused and scalpels boiled in enamel basins, the medical corps adapting techniques learned in jungle warfare to urban occupation duties. The transformation of daily life proceeded with bureaucratic precision that revealed the Communist Party's administrative experience. Ward committees posted lists of reporting requirements at 7 a.m. sharp, their schedules as regular as factory shifts. Former officials were sorted by rank and political involvement, creating categories that would determine everything from work assignments to family visitation rights. Individual stories emerged from the statistical mass of political transition. Many city residents had sewn gold leaves into Audai hems as insurance against uncertain times, and these small hoards became currency in negotiations with soldiers collecting weapons. The exchanges revealed complex human dynamics. PAVN fighters sometimes returned confiscated pistols if families offered enamel teapots and rice cakes, creating microeconomies of survival within the larger structure of occupation. The medical realities of sustained combat became apparent as units tallied their casualties. Veterans' memoirs would later count dozens of comrades killed in the campaign's final week, even as most organized resistance had collapsed. For political officers conducting unit roll calls, these losses served multiple purposes: honoring sacrifice, maintaining discipline, and creating martyrs for future propaganda. The names of the dead became part of revolutionary mythology, connecting individual sacrifice to collective triumph. Unit hygiene remained a constant concern even in victory. Saltwater foot baths were mandatory to combat trench rot that persisted in the tropical climate, and soldiers continued wearing their tire-tread Dep-Rau sandals through marble halls where South Vietnamese officials had entertained American generals. The contrast highlighted how far the revolution had traveled from its jungle origins while maintaining its practical focus on survival. Food distribution revealed the intersection of ideology and necessity. City rations now included seized baguettes, condensed milk, and tins of lavache cuirit cheese from abandoned shops, luxuries that seemed almost decadent to men who had survived on 700 grams of rice per day plus dried fish. A PAVN cook assigned to palace kitchens discovered copper pots and imported spices, boiling rice for 200 men in a battered wok, while seasoning it with what he described as the taste of pride. The 559th Transportation Group reported ongoing challenges with fuel distribution as punctured drums leaked precious diesel onto gravel roads. The transition to captured ARVN storage tanks solved immediate logistical problems while creating new dependencies on urban infrastructure that the party would need to maintain and control. Cultural transformation proceeded alongside political consolidation. Some PAVN squads bivouacked in cinema lobbies, sleeping atop velvet seats while projectors sat warm with reels of Hong Kong martial arts films half-threaded in their mechanisms. The image captured the surreal nature of revolutionary occupation, peasant soldiers dreaming in theatres designed for bourgeois entertainment. A sapper company marked time by church clocks, Notre Dame Cathedral's bells chiming the half-hour while laying telephone lines from palace to city hall. The mundane work of connecting new government facilities proceeded alongside dramatic moments, demonstrating that revolution required both bullets and bureaucracy. The sensory memory most frequently cited by first-time city entrants became part of unit folklore, hot asphalt smell mixing with bougainvillea's electric brightness, while the metallic tick of cooling tank engines provided rhythm to the advancing revolution. These physical sensations would become embedded in veterans' stories, connecting abstract political theory to concrete experience. Ammunition expenditure reports showed that most firefights consumed 300 to 500 rounds per platoon in brief engagements. The statistics reflected the reality that organized resistance had collapsed quickly, but isolated pockets of ARVN soldiers fought with desperate courage that earned grudging respect from their captors. Can you imagine the psychological complexity of occupying a city where every street corner held memories of comrades who hadn't lived to see victory? But even as PAVN units adapted to urban garrison duties, American radio interceptors were logging their final transmissions from Southeast Asia, marking the end of an era that had defined Cold War strategy for 2 decades. The last American radio transmission intercepted by PAVN signals intelligence crackled through their headphones at 11:47 a.m. on April 30th, a Marine corporal's voice counting evacuees with mechanical precision, before ending with a clipped out that seemed to echo across 3 decades of war. This wasn't just the end of American involvement in Vietnam. It was the moment when the global architecture of the Cold War shifted permanently eastward, proving that even superpowers could be bled white by determined resistance movements willing to sacrifice everything for independence. The silence that followed that final radio call represented more than military withdrawal. It marked the collapse of a strategic doctrine that had assumed Western technology and firepower could overcome any level of indigenous determination. For PAVN intelligence officers monitoring American frequencies, the sudden quiet felt like the sound of history turning a page. Engineers worked frantically to clear unexploded ordnance from Tan Son Nhut Air Base, marking hazards with red-painted pickets and ammunition crates that sprouted across the runways like deadly flowers. The irony was overwhelming. The same airfield that had launched B-52 raids deep into North Vietnam now required Vietnamese sappers to make it safe for civilian aircraft. Each marked bomb or artillery shell represented not just explosive danger, but symbolic vindication of a strategy that had turned American firepower against itself. The Thiethen Ghe Zoo's elephants continued trumpeting at night as artillery echoed from distant suburbs, their ancient voices adding a surreal soundtrack to urban warfare that would be remembered by every soldier who heard it. Keepers fed them cassava leaves scavenged from villa gardens, maintaining routines of animal care even as human institutions collapsed around them. The elephants' cries seemed to bridge the gap between the natural world and the artificial constructs of war and politics. For many PAVN fighters, the sensory overload of urban occupation proved more challenging than jungle combat. The combination of hot asphalt smell, bougainvillea's electric brightness, and the metallic tick of cooling tank engines created a sensory signature that would define victory in their memories. These physical impressions became embedded in unit folklore, connecting abstract political theory to the concrete reality of revolution accomplished. A captured ARVN radio van had been converted into an impromptu recording studio where soldiers cut victory songs onto reel-to-reel tape while tanks idled outside. The juxtaposition perfectly captured the intersection of military triumph and cultural transformation, the modern technology, serving ancient songs of liberation that had sustained the movement through decades of struggle. The recordings would later be broadcast throughout the newly liberated territories, carrying the voices of common soldiers into homes where families had hidden from bombing raids for years. The administrative machinery of victory operated with bureaucratic precision that revealed decades of Communist Party experience in governing complex populations. Post-victory, PAVN quartermasters issued city-made sandals and khaki shirts to replace jungle uniforms, though many soldiers kept their forest camouflage as talismans from Truong Son mountain days. The transition from guerrilla fighters to occupation troops required more than new clothes. It demanded a psychological transformation that many veterans would struggle with for years. Cultural cells organized entertainment programs that served multiple purposes beyond morale building. Van Kong Song breaks on palace lawns featured revolutionary classics like Jie Phong Mien Nam and Namanem Tren Mot Chiek Zay Tung, performed for growing crowds of curious civilians. The performances demonstrated that the new government controlled not just military force, but cultural expression, a crucial element in establishing legitimacy among urban populations who had lived under different systems. The smell of wet paper rose from heaps of shredded ministry files after sudden tropical downpours, state secrets dissolving into pulp, while children paddled paper boats along curb streams. The image captured the speed of institutional collapse documents that had seemed permanently important, becoming playground materials within hours of defeat. For PAV soldiers watching government records decompose in gutters, the scene provided visceral proof that even the most elaborate bureaucracies were temporary constructions. Medical units faced challenges that extended beyond treating combat casualties. PAVN medics found themselves processing thousands of ARVN prisoners who required everything from basic first aid to psychological counseling. The irony of former enemies sharing medical facilities wasn't lost on anyone. Men who had been shooting at each other days before now waited in the same aid station queues. In Chur Ben Than market, the smell of pomfret and catfish mixed with gun oil as vendors adapted to serve customers who had never seen electric lights before entering the city. Street vendors sold iced tea and beer bottles for 2 to 3 dong to horse soldiers, creating microeconomies that bridged the gap between revolutionary ideology and commercial necessity. The speed of market adaptation revealed something profound about human resilience and the practical requirements of survival under any political system. Technical challenges persisted even in victory. Tank crews reported mechanical problems from urban warfare that hadn't appeared in jungle operations. T-54 engines overheating in stop-and-go movement through narrow alleys, forcing crews to pry roofing tin off fenders while clearing bicycle frames jammed in tracks. The mundane realities of armored warfare in urban environments provided a counterpoint to the heroic narrative of liberation. A PAVN liaison team discovered that a tourist map of Saigon printed in English proved more useful for navigation than some clandestine sketches prepared by underground cells. The irony wasn't subtle. American tourism materials helping communist forces control the city they had just conquered. The map's clear ward numbers and street layouts had been designed to help visitors find restaurants and hotels. Now, they guided military patrols through districts where resistance might still emerge. Can you feel the weight of historical inevitability settling over a city where the sounds of celebration mixed with the mechanical noise of occupation? But even as PAVN units established control over South Vietnam's former capital, the deeper implications of their victory were already rippling outward through a global order that would never be the same. By September 15, 1975, painters working through Saigon's humid afternoons carefully stenciled Than Pho Ho Chi Minh onto government building facades, each brushstroke erasing another fragment of the Republic of Vietnam from official memory. This final transformation marked more than administrative housekeeping. It represented the Communist Party's determination to control not just territory but historical narrative, ensuring that future generations would know this place only by the name of their revolutionary founder. The methodical renaming process revealed something profound about the nature of political victory. Conquering a city required tanks and artillery, but conquering its identity demanded paintbrushes and patient bureaucracy. The Fall of Saigon had ended a war, but the creation of Ho Chi Minh City would define a peace that would reshape Southeast Asia for decades to come. The sensory memories that veterans carried from those final days would become part of revolutionary folklore passed down through generations of party historians. The combination of hot asphalt smell, Bougainvillea's electric brightness, and the metallic tick of cooling tank engines in noon sun had created a signature that defined victory for thousands of men who had survived 30 years of warfare. These physical impressions would outlast political speeches and propaganda posters, becoming the authentic texture of triumph embedded in human memory. Macro-political framing from Hanoi emphasized that April 30th represented closure to a 30-year struggle that began with Ho Chi Minh's Declaration of Independence in 1945. Revolutionary slogans compressed this historical arc into 4 words: Dok Lup Tu Do Thong, Nut Han Phuc, independence, freedom, unification, happiness. The linguistic compression reflected communist political theory's power to reduce complex historical processes into memorable formulas that could be taught to school children and chanted at mass rallies. The human cost of transformation became apparent in the stories that emerged from those chaotic final days. Major Buang Lee's desperate landing of a tiny O-1 Bird Dog observation plane on the USS Midway's flight deck, his family crammed into a cockpit designed for one person, captured the desperation of those caught on the wrong side of history. Deck crews had literally dumped helicopters overboard to clear landing space, creating an image that defined America's chaotic withdrawal from a war that had consumed a generation. More than a dozen helicopters were shoved into the South China Sea from carriers like the USS Blue Ridge and USS Midway, their million-dollar hulks disappearing beneath the waves to make room for human cargo. The deck logs that recorded these losses told a story of priorities reversed military hardware sacrificed to save civilian lives in a war that had too often seemed to value machines over people. For PAVN commanders, the speed of political consolidation proved as crucial as armored thrusts in securing lasting victory. They had planned administrative structures in parallel with military operations, ensuring that political officers could establish control immediately after combat units secured territory. This dual-track approach reflected lessons learned from earlier campaigns, where military success had been undermined by administrative failures. The transformation of daily life proceeded with relentless efficiency that demonstrated the Communist Party's experience governing complex populations. Freight trains loaded with northern cement and rebar rolled toward the newly renamed city by June, their cargo representing more than reconstruction materials. Each car carried the physical manifestation of reunification, northern industrial capacity flowing south to rebuild what war had destroyed. Bridge repair teams targeted spans over Vam Kor Dong and Dong Nai rivers first, recognizing that transportation infrastructure would determine whether political unification could become economic reality. The prosaic work of rebuilding bridges and railways would prove as important as any military victory in creating the unified nation that communist theorists had envisioned for decades. Veterans' memoirs would later emphasize the dozens of comrades killed in the campaign's final week, even as most organized resistance had collapsed. The casualties were memorialized in unit roll calls that served multiple purposes: honoring sacrifice, maintaining military discipline, and creating martyrs for future propaganda. The names of the dead became part of revolutionary mythology, connecting individual sacrifice to collective triumph. The cultural transformation extended beyond government buildings to streets where children learned new songs. Celebrating memory of palace kitchens stocked with copper pots and imported spices became emblematic of the revolution's encounter with urban luxury. He had boiled rice for 200 men in a battered wok, seasoning it with fish sauce and what he described as the taste of pride. The contrast between revolutionary austerity and bourgeois abundance would define many veterans' experiences of victory. By mid-1976, reunification proposals were being implemented with the same methodical precision that had characterized military planning. The party understood that winning the peace required different skills than winning the war. Off with a clipped out had marked more than military withdrawal. It represented the end of an era when Western powers could assume that superior technology and firepower could overcome indigenous determination. The silence that followed would echo through strategic planning rooms in Washington and Moscow, forcing both superpowers to recalculate the mathematics of Cold War intervention. Can you hear the weight of history settling into silence as the last helicopter fades over the South? More than the Vietnam War, it had proven that even empires could be defeated by farmers with rifles and an unshakable belief in their cause, a lesson that would resonate through liberation movements from Central America to Afghanistan for decades to come.